Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today we're here to talk about our favorite friend/foe, the INFJ, and all 8 cognitive functions, all accounted for, and how that plays into all of the INFJ's actions and how they perceive the outside world. One thing I want to make very clear before we begin, though, is that I'm not going to do this kind of video for all 16 types. We ISTJs are very much routine and pattern oriented, and so we like to recall personal details in our lives. And so if I don't have enough experience with a Myers-Briggs type, I'm not going to want to talk about it, because if I wanted to just spout out only facts and nothing else, I just put a link to one of the types and I just have you go read it. But because I've been around INFJs so much, and they have been both some of the best memories and worst experiences of my life, I feel like I'm pretty certified to talk about them. In addition, most of you that comment on my Myers-Briggs videos are INFJs, and pretty much all of you have said that I really get your type in a way that no other sensing type does. So I guess my experiences really pay off. I'm also going to hold off for now on talking about the Linda Barron's interaction styles. Those are additional adjectives such as pragmatic versus affiliative, initiating versus responding, concrete versus abstract. I memorized what the INFJ all has, but I'm not sure if I agree with the description, so I don't think it would be appropriate for me to say, oh, well, INFJs are labeled as direct when I think they seem more informative. So until I have further studies and further confirmation, I'm just going to pass on that. So for now, we're going to look at the cognitive functions, give a few personal examples, and if the Enigma type of the INFJ does good, let me know down in the comments. So we're going to start out with introverted intuition. This is also the dominant function of the INTJ. Introverted intuitives in the dominant are extremely futuristic and very deep individuals. They love to think about what will happen, what is going to happen in the future, and they like to make plans to be able to make it happen. INFJs and INTJs are not content with just letting the future happen. They want to actively make a plan, and they often are very convinced about what it is that they want going forward. They often have this big career plan, or they want to change the world, or maybe they're even thinking about retirement plans. It doesn't have to be something super grand, but they typically have a really hard time living in the moment due to their inferior function. So their introverted intuition is going to want to make them constantly think several years in advance, sometimes even 100 years in advance. And if you think I'm joking, watch my video that I did in 2021 with Yoshi Perspectives. He had a contingency plan for when he was 112 and he was like in his 20s. So that should tell you how far ahead those INFJs like to think. But not only is introverted intuition about the future, it's also about taking a look at hypothetical concepts, theories, philosophies, and trying to find some kind of deeper meaning behind all of it. They often like to talk about the big picture, which as a sensor, it's kind of hard for me to understand what that means, but based on what I've studied and based on what the INFJs have told me, basically what the big picture is it means how does everything make sense from their point of view? How is it that this bit of truth and this bit of truth and this theory and this concept, how do they all come together to form something cohesive? So the INFJ is going to take maybe a concept that they really like or an idea and want to flesh it out. They're going to try to think, okay, is there some kind of additional meaning to this? Could it be that maybe we've only scratched the surface? They tend to talk in a lot of fancy metaphors and they're very rarely straightforward. But when they are, they typically have the goal of furthering their futuristic outlook. And if being straightforward means a better way of getting to that outcome, they can be willing to camouflage themselves as pretty much any types for the sake of their goals, which is why sometimes they get the negative stereotype of being a little bit too altruistic, because they're so goal-oriented that sometimes they can ignore things like common courtesy or people's feelings in the process. Thankfully, with the second function, it isn't as common in the INFJs, which is extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is a function that's all about being able to pick up on people's emotions and want to act in a way that the people or the person whose emotions the INFJ are feeling are in harmony and their emotions are being taken care of. This is also the secondary function for the ISFJ. So you'll often find that those two types in particular seem to really be drawn to positions of counseling or service or in some kind of capacity where they can help people. Usually they want to make a difference to change the world, but whereas the ISFJ is going to be thinking about how to do it within a routine, the INFJ is going to be thinking about how to do it going forward, how to make a new plan of how to help people with their feelings. And they're going to be slightly better at detecting people's feelings than the ISFJ because they have the intuition. Their intuition is going to look beyond the surface level and say, I'm noticing that this person's eyebrows are furrowed. There's got to be a deeper meaning to that than the person just having their muscles twitching. So they're going to intuitively try to jump ahead a few steps and try to say, oh, I get it. It all makes sense. Now I understand that this person is feeling sad. Now keep in mind some INFJs can get a bit arrogant with their extroverted feeling, where they think that just because they're empathetic and they can pick up on people's emotions really easily means that they're always right. And so whenever they make a decision to try to help someone, that is the best decision. And I think I have a theory as to why they're so cocky if we go to their tertiary function. So for now, I'll just say it's great that you INFJs are really empathetic and you care about people's feelings, but you got to keep your tertiary function in check to make sure that you're actually fact-checking what it is that you're picking up on. Maybe what you think is a good idea isn't actually a good idea, but at least you're IJ, so not EJ, so you're a little bit softer about it. Going into the tertiary function, this is introverted thinking, which is also the tertiary function for ISFJs. Introverted thinking is described as wanting an internal understanding of how the world works. Some people have described it as an internal logical framework. Rather than looking for outside sources or some kind of objective analysis, introverted thinkers are going to prioritize how does this make sense to me? How do I understand how things work? So coupled with introverted intuition, INFJs are not only going to want to know how things work, but how all of these concepts actually play out. How do these concepts make sense to them? So it often makes INFJs significantly more interested in philosophy than, say, an ISFJ would be, where they're more on the concrete side. And so with introverted thinking being in the tertiary, this means that INFJs are surprisingly logical if you give them the opportunity to use logical reasoning. Because it's only in the third and not the inferior, they're not apathetic towards using logic. They often will brag and again get a bit big-headed saying, I'm actually a very logical person, and just because I'm a feeling type doesn't mean I can't reason. I don't think anyone's questioning that you can reason. It's just that what you come across as, which is why you have the F in the title of your name, is a very compassionate, warm, loving person, and you don't show that more analytical, objective side of yourself. Of course, I find it rich that introverted thinkers call themselves objective when the definition of introverted feeling is internal logical framework, not the logical framework. So if it's personal, how can it be objective? It just doesn't make sense to me. There's probably an introverted statement right there. So the reason why I said earlier that INFJs can come across as a bit arrogant when it comes to their extroverted feeling analysis is that introverted thinking is always paired with extroverted feeling, no matter where it is on your function stack. So every extroverted feeler is going to be an introverted thinker. And so with introverted thinking wanting to understand how everything works, INFJs are going to pick up on all of these emotions with their extroverted feeling, and their introverted thinking is going to process what do these emotions mean. But here's the kicker. They're going to ask, how do they make sense to me? Not to the individual, to me. And so they can think that they know what's better for someone when they actually don't. They might think, oh, it might be better for this person if I just don't say anything and be passive aggressive, when no, that is not the best thing to do. That actually makes several types angry, especially the TJ types. You do not want to skirt on telling the truth. You want to absolutely get it out. But this isn't a video about ISTJs. We can probably say that in their video. To INFJs' credit, though, they usually use their introverted thinking in such a way that it makes them come across as really intelligent and smart, because they do like to look at things in a very logical way. And they try to think that they're being objective, and sometimes they are, but it does lead to them having a remarkable understanding of how things work and especially how people work. But another flaw of it being in the tertiary position is that INFJs aren't particularly great at explaining their reasoning. The TP types are much better at just being able to spew out all these logical facts and logical leaps that they make, and they're able to come across as like a lawyer or a detective because they're just so in tune with what is the process of being able to break something down. INFJs are a bit weaker in that respect, so usually some of their decisions don't always make sense, especially from the ISTJ's perspective. And so the higher up thinking types, especially the TJ types, might be like, that was such an incredibly stupid and boneheaded decision. What the heck were you thinking? And the INFJs will try to explain it, but they'll often either use too many words, or they won't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense. And especially with them being intuitives, they might use analogies or metaphors that'll just confuse the SJ types even more. So they end up not only being abstract, but they also end up being confusing. And so because it's internal, they have a harder time describing it than they would simply describing something on an emotional level. So that's why I think INFJs should study how the other types think, especially the sensing types, and I think that would help them to be able to do some kind of external measure to write out or express what's going on in here. Maybe a journal entry, or maybe like a skit or something that might help illustrate the point further for the visual learners. And for the audio learners, just study how other people communicate. That, I guess, like the INTPs and the ENTPs would have more of an advantage there with their introverted thinking being higher up. So if INFJs can get it so that it's relatively close to their introverted feeling, they could potentially be the greatest understanders in the world. They just gotta give it a little bit more practice. On to the inferior function, the thing that the INFJ seemingly struggles with the most, but once we get to the shadow functions, you'll see that that's not actually the case, is extroverted sensing. This is also the inferior function for INTJs, so you'll notice that they have similar weaknesses. And that's that extroverted sensing is a function that governs being aware of external tangible realities and living in that current reality. But because INFJs lead with introverted intuition and their extroverted sensing is all the way down here, they often have this war going on inside their mind where they like want to be futuristic and they're suppressing the part of them that wants to live in the moment and have fun. So a lot of times if you try to tell the INFJ, stop overthinking, just live in the now, just enjoy yourself, they're going to be really upset by that. And they're going to say, but what about my big plans for the future? Why can't I analyze this? Why can't I go deeper? If they're willing to accept their inferior function, INFJs can be surprisingly in the moment, and they might really enjoy sensual, not to be confused with sexual, sensual experiences such as going to the water park or dancing or having wind flowing on their face. They might really enjoy these experiences and start seeking them out. However, what proves that it's in the inferior is that they don't tend to enjoy these type of experiences. They tend to repress them. They tend to not like letting themselves go and be silly. They tend to not like living in the moment, but they especially aren't even aware of what's going on around them. So a lot of times INFJs can have a reputation for being very clumsy and being very like scatterbrained, where they might like bump into a wall or not notice what's going on around them. And it can often make me wonder how they get their driver's license, because they might like go right past a stop sign and not even notice because their sensing was so low. If INFJs are able to practice sensory awareness techniques, even if they have to just look at their own hand and keep going over and over again, what are the little details about their hand, like the veins in their hand or the bone structure. Little steps like that can help them be more aware of the sensory world and also maybe help them realize that maybe what they wanted for the future isn't actually good for them. Again, it's introverted intuition, meaning it's all about them. Just because they think the plan is going to work doesn't mean that it's a good plan. And a lot of times with their extroverted sensing, this can lead to them being too confident that their plan is going to work. So when it doesn't and they made a miscalculation because their introverted thinking is so low, they get extremely agitated and furious, and sometimes they'll even shut people out of their lives because they're wondering, how could I have miscalculated this? I could have sworn I kept into account every single variable here. And it's because they have what's called tunnel vision. They think so heavily about what they're going towards that they forget what's going on around them, and it can lead to them not being able to be happy for where they are in the moment. To give a common example that seems to be pretty common in INTJs and INFJs, those types usually really want to be in romantic relationships. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them really like the more sensual and sexual aspects of it because sex is inherently a very extroverted, sensing-y thing to want. It's very much engaging the whole body and engaging the outer senses. And so they often idealize their perfect sexual fantasy, or for the sake of keeping this more G-rated, the ideal partner, the person that fits every single one of their categories. And say someone comes along and is like, hey, I'll date you. Their standards are so high that they'll have to say, nah, not gonna work. And then let's say that they're not actively searching for someone and they're just single in the moment, they might not want to be single in the moment. They're so determined that this future has to happen where they envision themselves being married and they envision themselves having kids, that while they're not at that point, they get uneasy. And so when an INFJ develops their inferior sensing, they can get to the point where they're saying, okay, maybe my grand crazy plan hasn't happened yet, but it takes time for plans to happen. And so I am okay with this current period of waiting. Now that we've bashed them enough for their main four function stacks, let's get into the shadow functions. Now the shadow functions are slightly harder to explain, hence why Myers-Briggs doesn't even list them in the function stack. But basically what the shadow functions are there are parts of you that are so weak that you don't even really notice them, and when you do, you end up looking like a total buffoon. So in the INFJ's case, their fifth function is extroverted intuition. Now the sixth function, I've heard it, the fifth function, having a dyslexia moment. The fifth function is sometimes described as the admiration function or the underutilized function, where like you admire people who use your fifth function, and sometimes you might get pleasure from actively engaging in it, but you are not going to desire taking those types of experiences on a regular basis. So in the case of the INFJ, extroverted intuition means that they might really appreciate the sense of humor that the TJ and FP types have. They might say, oh wow, you guys have really funny jokes, and might occasionally like to go on tangents when they talk. They might occasionally like to try out a new idea, but it's not the norm. They have introverted intuition, so that's more of a focused, goal-driven approach to intuition as opposed to trying to connect every little loose end and figure out how it all connects. To the INFJ, that's just not natural for them to think like that. So while they may occasionally entertain an ENFP or an ENTP's flights of fancy or some crazy new idea, they're not going to want to do that for too long because it'll get in the way of their plan. But if they're willing to develop their extroverted intuition, INFJs can sometimes, I've straight up heard them say to me, Paul, I really love trying new experiences. I like innovating. So you might be thinking, well, if that's the case, then why is extroverted intuition lower for the higher for the ISTJs and ISFJs? Well, for the ISTJ and ISFJ, it's in the inferior because it's what they fear. They fear chaos. They fear the unknown. But they think about it. They have all these catastrophic feelings of like, oh great, everything is going wrong. The INFJ doesn't do that. The INFJ instead catastrophizes over the moment, the what is happening, over the what could happens. So they don't actively think about new ideas or new possibilities very often, but they'll occasionally like to entertain it. Next up, their sixth function is called introverted feeling. The way that I've heard the sixth function described is that it's the occasionally shows up in strong bursts, but it's usually not in a conscious way. It's sometimes described as it just happens and the INFJ isn't aware of it happening, but like it can be surprisingly strong if developed. So in the case of the INFJ, they often don't realize what they're actually feeling because they're so busy taking in everyone else's emotions and thinking about what other people feel that they often neglect their personal feelings and their personal values. This is why they sometimes come across as social chameleons, because they'll alter their values or they'll alter the way that they speak to make other people happy. And so they don't take enough time to check in with their own personal values. And as a result, it can lead to INFJs feeling overburdened. And that's why they sometimes have a tendency to disappear and make everyone else miserable because they're like, oh shoot, I just realized I have emotions. I better figure out what I'm feeling. But because it's introverted, they can't like go talk about it with everyone else because they don't have extroverted thinking to be like, this is what I'm feeling. So they often withdraw from people so that they have more of an opportunity to really analyze their emotions, but at the same time hurting other people's feelings. So way to be a hypocrite, INFJs. How I've noticed introverted feeling coming out in strong, uncontrollable bursts for INFJs is that sometimes they kind of just blurt out a strong emotion kind of out of nowhere, and it's like very disconnected from like either what they were talking about before or after. It just kind of just seems to come out of nowhere. Like sometimes an INFJ might start crying and then the INFJ will apologize and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't want to cry, it wasn't something I planned on, I kind of just was triggered. Whereas like the FP types would probably be more in control and they'd say, I am choosing to pursue this emotion because this is who I am, this is my identity. Whereas the INFJ might be a bit more embarrassed and say, oh, that was silly of me, I shouldn't have made you uncomfortable by being vulnerable like that. So they might also struggle with wanting to express their emotions to people because they don't think about it enough to be able to properly put it into words. But if an INFJ is able to develop their values enough, then they can use that as a way of not being as naive when it comes to trying to do their plans, and they can like stand up for themselves more and say, now wait a minute, I actually believe in certain things, and so I am going to use my introverted feeling to say this is what I believe and this is where I'm going to draw the line and not give in to my extroverted sensing. Now we get into the tough part, because this is where the INFJs start getting really defensive whenever I bring this up. But keep in mind that Myers-Briggs and the system of how it categorizes things is it does not care about your feelings. It cares about generalities. So if you happen to be pretty good at these next two functions, good for you. But that doesn't mean that you're either not an INFJ or that they're still not in your bottom. It just means you've developed it enough to give the illusion that it's not. However, most INFJs will still fall into certain traps regardless that the types that have them higher up will not fall into those pitfalls. So here's where the controversy starts. The seventh function is known as the blind spot or the polar point of least resistance function. It is technically the lowest, or not the lowest, the weakest function that every type has. And this is the function that is so low and so unused that the type often doesn't even realize that it's there. They don't actively think about it. And they're usually very confused and blindsided by other types when they use it. And sometimes they can find it to be very ridiculous, and they might like be very apathetic or like make fun of other types. So for INFJs, that would be extroverted thinking. Now, how extroverted thinking works in the types that use it more, which are the TJ and, well, the TJs would use it in the top two, and the bottom two would be the FP types. Extroverted thinking likes efficiency. It likes to get things done as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. It also tends to prioritize wanting more objective truth, looking at things as they are as opposed to how the individual perceives it. So it's more of an unbiased, unfiltered take on reality. Extroverted thinkers also tend to be a bit more forceful when it comes to enforcing how things should be and what will be more effective, whereas INFJs with their extroverted feeling might be reluctant to be more enforcing because they're not wanting to hurt people's feelings. So how blind spot extroverted thinking works for INFJs and also the ISFJs is that they're typically not very good at being effective. They're not typically very good at time management. They're not good at being able to use their time effectively, and they often moan and groan about how busy they are and how they're just so swamped in work. And they're like, oh my gosh, I just have so much going on, and what the heck is wrong with me? I can't get anything done. And they're just constantly in this never ending loop of basically kind of creating their own problems, because like the types that would use it more would naturally employ strategies to get things done effectively before it all piles up, and so as a result they have more of a relaxed atmosphere than the INFJ would. For instance, a TJ type would naturally get things done so effectively and quickly that they wouldn't allow themselves to be overworked, whereas INFJs don't realize that they're being overworked. And so a lot of times they have to take a step back, again, disappear, and think, shoot, I have so many unread texts that I got to take care of. How am I going to get through this? I need to really think about it because that's my blind spot. Another thing that I've noticed that how this plays out in INFJs is that they don't like confrontation. They don't like telling people what to do, but they especially don't like being blunt about what it is that they're thinking. They don't naturally tend to be able to just spew out their thoughts on a whim. Even if you were to ask an INFJ a question like, okay, I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me, what do you think about this? A lot of INFJs will give really long pauses. They might say a lot of ums and uhs, or if they've really not developed their extroverted thinking, they won't even say the part. They'll just say, I think that this is what I have in mind. As opposed to the FP and TJ types where they're just like, yeah, here's what I think. Like, not even, it doesn't even take them that long, and sometimes they even come to conclusions while they talk. INFJs don't typically do that. They like to really take their time to really think about what is the perfect response, what is the perfect logical explanation for this. Most of the types don't want perfection, they just want an answer, so that can sometimes be why the INFJ comes across as too unpunctual or too slow, because they're just not good at using their extroverted thinking. However, one of you watching this may be thinking that I'm really being on the attack, so credit where credit is due. Efficiency is something that you can learn and you can develop. Well, you can really learn and develop anything. I think an INFJ could theoretically research outside sources and learn how to be efficient. It just won't ever be a go-to method that they will naturally be able to do without consciously thinking about it. That's why it's not in their top 4. Because if they naturally thought about efficiency, they would be a TJ type. But being FJs, they hardly ever think about efficiency. So they have to strain themselves to really say, okay, I am going to be efficient. I am going to get things done effectively. I am going to be organized. And then they can be. They just often have to be told by other people that they're failing. And then after they've accumulated enough criticism and after they've worn themselves out enough, then they can start realizing, I gotta work on the shadow functions, and then they can be pretty effective. I don't know if they'll ever be able to truly catch up to a TJ type without just saying, hey, I was wrong, I am actually a TJ type. But they can at least get to the point where the TJ types can respect them. Finally, we get to the 8th function, which is called the demon function. The way I've described the demon function is that it's what's called the migraine function. It's the function that is so counter to your natural impulses that it literally strains your brain to try to use it, and it ends up just making you want to give up. So for the INFJ, that would be introverted sensing. INFJs absolutely despise doing the same thing over and over again. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, they're judging types, so they like their structure and they like organization. They like organization, but they don't necessarily like routine. They might do routine for a little bit, but that's only as a means to get to their goal. However, they won't want to do it forever. If you were to tell literally any INFJ in the world, hey, you know what? Just do the same thing for the rest of your life. Don't do any further goals. Just be okay with having the same meal and the same food and the same lifestyle. They'll be like, oh, heck no, you gotta be kidding me. I have a strong desire to do more. I don't want to be stuck in this rut my whole life. They have a lot of animosity towards familiarity. And oftentimes, relying on the past is something that they hate doing. They want to branch out, they want to go further, and being forced to just do the same old thing is going to make them very, very drained. In fact, this is why they're so enigmatic with ISTJs, is because the ISTJ likes doing the same things over and over again. They like being in their rut. They love their structure. And the INFJ is just baffled by that because they're like, why would you want to be stuck in that? And sometimes it can lead to a bit of insulting by the INFJ because they might say to the ISTJ, oh, you ISTJs have no ambition whatsoever. You never want to do anything futuristic. You just want to sit there and be a stick in the mud all the time. When ISTJs have their own things to say about INFJs, so they're not exactly saints either. Bottom line is INFJs typically have pretty bad memories. They don't really keep track of their personal past a whole lot. They don't look at something and immediately have this gut impulse of saying, oh, that looks familiar. A lot of times, instead of thinking about how the thing looks familiar, they'll think, what is the hidden meaning behind what I'm looking at? Now, if the hidden meaning involves the past, they might do it as a means to an end, but they won't naturally come to that conclusion. So how the heck do you develop a demon function? Honestly, I have no idea, but if I had to take a guess, I would say that INFJs could probably learn from their past by being willing to repeat it more often. However, one thing I've recently learned is that most extroverted sensors, or the ones that have them in the top 4, are going to speak a lot in the third person, and they're also going to talk about what other people are doing as opposed to what they are doing. So INFJs don't often talk about what they personally are observing and what they personally are sensing. They might talk about the overall vibe of an event or the overall feeling, but they're not going to go in depth about the details. They're not going to think about the sensory elements of like a vacation or a good memory. They're going to think, you know what? I was happy, and like give this very vague statement. In fact, INFJs can sometimes be so bad with details that I'll often have to press them for a follow-up comment on my videos because they'll be so vague, because they expect me to make these intuitive leaps and I am not. So oftentimes like an INFJ might say like, oh wow, you did such a great job in your video, I'll feel so understood, and I'll be like, well, how do you feel so understood? What part of the video was it that specifically got you to think like that? And then they'll go into another overview saying, well, the general tone of your voice, and it doesn't really narrow down to an exact spot, an exact moment. It's still very much an overview. So a lot of times INFJs who have learned to develop their introverted sensing will write longer, more detailed messages because they want to overcompensate for the sensing types not being able to fill in the blanks. However, a lot of INFJs don't like doing this, and that's why sometimes they take long breaks from people because they're like, okay, I live in a world full of sensors and they need all these unnecessary trivial details and I just can't stand it. I need to take a break from having to explain literally everything because they just can't take a hint. And so I think that's also why they're introverts, is because to them it's too exhausting to try to accommodate for the detail-oriented people of the world. It's too exhausting to try to live in the moment, and it's even more exhausting for them to live in the past, because if they live too much in the past, then they're not going to be able to get towards their goals. So, how to develop introverted sensing? Write things down, journal, look at pictures, try your best to like recall the details, and if you can't, just try to recall anything about the past, and slowly, very slowly, you'll get used to it. So hopefully I didn't bash INFJs too much. They are my enigma type and they confuse me to no end, but I would say overall INFJs make for some of my best friends after we've overcome the initial hurdle of the different ways that we talk. But getting to that point is often very much a chore. I think the INFJs that have been around me will often say that I'm actually not sure what they say that's nice about me. I think they say that I'm nice by ISTJ standards, but still not like very empathetic, or it's like fake empathy because they'll say, well, you're a Catholic and so you've like taught yourself how to be sympathetic to people's feelings, but it's not like a natural gut impulse for you. They tend to be pretty affirming, even if it's very weirdly worded, so that I'm left sometimes even more confused, like, that was meant to be a compliment, but I didn't understand the compliment. So, a lot of times I think INFJs could be my best friends if they learn how to communicate very effectively and detail-oriented, and if they're able to have more of a realistic filter on their goals, where they don't just think so much about this is what I want that it ends up becoming an impossibility. That's where the extroverted intuitives come in and say, you forgot about the what-ifs. You were so focused on the whens, you forgot about the whats. So we can learn from each other. And bottom line, if ISTJs and INFJs can eventually get to the point where they can try to reach a mutual understanding with each other, however that's possible, they can offer each other really good insights. ISTJs can learn how to maybe do more than what they're already doing in life. They might learn to try to pay attention to body language and maybe like get to know people's feelings so that they can be more effective at their own communication, so that they're not just spouting out mean things and hurting people. INFJs could learn to be more detail-oriented and pay more attention to the little things. They might learn to think out loud a bit more and be able to express their thoughts on the spot. They might also learn how to be more efficient and how to get things done in more of an unbiased way without always letting people's feelings slow them down. So with that, thank you very much for watching. This was a really hard video to make, but it was also so much fun at the same time because I really love explaining things in a step-by-step format. So if you're an INFJ watching this, let me know what you think. Was I scarily accurate in how I portrayed your type, or was I totally wrong and you think that I should quit doing Myers-Briggs and I'm an absolute fraud on this channel? It's not in the name, so I wouldn't be embarrassed if you did say that. If you're not an INFJ, what do you relate to on any of the function descriptions that I said? What are your experiences with INFJs? Do you think I've described them well enough, or do you think that the ones that you're with are more of the exceptions? Either way, let me know anyway. I love reading the comments. I love responding to them even more than I love reading them, because extroverted thinking, we love our blabbing. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat for helping me out financially. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!